Hey, John. Finn.
Hiya, Jaya. How's it going?
Good now. How are you? Long
Good.
time.
It's good. It's been a while, yeah. How are you
Great to
keeping?
be here. Great.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for
Great.
sharing. I just saw you shared the link, Jaya. That's why I'm here.
Super. Good man.
Right, so we're live on YouTube now.
Great. Excellent. Thanks, Decky. We'll stop having a chat.
So, how are you doing? We're just kicking off now. We're just gone a little bit past 8. So, my name is Becky and I'm with Rebel Reads. So this is going to be the first of what we hope to be quite a long series of videos that will include, sorry, feedback is going to happen in a second. So this is going to be a live talk from Fin Dwyer of the Irish History Podcast. We're going to have some workshops, some Skillshare videos, and as many different events as we can get together over the next while. So just for anyone in the Zoom call, I'll ask you to stay muted and keep your cameras off until the question part of the event. And anyone on YouTube, feel free to drop in any questions for the end of the event at any time. And please say hi too, and feel free to share this as far and wide as you like. So I'll hand you over to Finn now, who's going to give us our first talk. Finn has done a series on his own podcast, the Irish History Podcast, on the Great Famine, and he's going to give a presentation on the Great Famine today for us. So thanks a lot for joining us, Finn, and I'm just going to hand over to you
now. Thanks very much, Becky, and thanks to everyone at Rebel Reads for inviting me along and to talk about the Great Famine. So basically tonight, what I'm going to try and do anyway is run through the history of the Great Famine. Then I'm going to look a little bit about some resistance to the Great Famine. I think that's important in terms of understanding the history of this event. And then at the end, I'm also going to address, I suppose, what's becoming a more and more controversial issue around the history of the Great Famine, and that is whether what happened in Ireland in the 1840s constitutes a genocide. I suppose the best place to begin is at the start. But before we get into the history, actually, it's worth, I suppose, framing the Great Famine in that over the last certainly 5-6 years, there's been an awful lot of talk in Ireland about the revolutionary period from 1913 to 23, and that's understandable. We're going through the centenary of it, but that can create the impression maybe that that's the most important event in our history. And certainly it's a very important chapter with the foundation of the state. But hopefully over the next 30-35 minutes through this talk, I'm going to make an argument that I think actually the Great Famine is a far more important event. And actually, you could argue that maybe the War of Independence and the revolutionary period is an outworking of the tensions that build up during the Great Famine. So to start, what I'm going to do is just give a brief overview of what Irish society was like on the eve of the Great Famine in 1845, because it's a bit different maybe than what we expect. There's often this image put forward that it's a society of extremes, of impoverished, poor peasants on one side, and then these all-powerful landlords on the other. Now that is part of the story, but Ireland in 1845 is a complex place. So for example, if you'd come to Ireland, the two biggest cities on the island are Belfast and Dublin, and Belfast in particular is a very industrialized city. It's going to become one of the major industrial hubs across the United Kingdom in the 20th century. So you have heavy industry taking off in Belfast at this time. There's also some factories in Dublin. So you have the start of an early industrial economy emerging in parts of Ireland. Then in terms of rural agriculture, it's still where most of the people live and work. The society or the picture varies there too. So in the east, you have these huge ranches where cattle tend to be farmed. It's in counties like Meath, and the poor tend to live on these very small tracts of land around those cattle farms. And in those communities, that these tenant farmers live on the most, or these laborers living on these tiny plots of land have the most precarious existence, where they only rent what's called land on a con-acre basis. That's basically where they get a plot of land that's planted with potatoes, and they get that in return for work or a small amount of money. It's an almost quasi feudal economy. Then in the West, you tend to have the more stereotypical tenant farmers. These are people who rent plots of land, maybe up to 5 acres in size. These are the small tenant farmers. But then you also have a class of larger tenant farmers, and they'll be important in our story as well. They have larger farms. They produce a surplus of food. They often have cattle, but also maybe in the south in particular, in counties like Kilkenny, where I am, Tipperary, East Cork, they'll grow crops. So what I'm trying to do is create this idea that you've got a pretty mixed economy. So something that happens doesn't necessarily affect everyone equally. So if you have a failure in, for example, if you've got a bad crop one year, that particularly affects the big farms in the south. It may not affect the industrial economy in Belfast and Dublin, or the cattle-based economy that's taking hold in Meath. However, all this society is underpinned by one thing, and that's the potato. So Ireland on the eve of the famine has a population of somewhere between 8 and 9 million people. We don't know for certain. The 1841 census records the population at 8.14 million people. That's almost certainly a massive underestimation. But the entire population is essentially, potatoes are the glue that holds this society together. So the poor in all these different economies that exist side by side within Ireland are dependent to one degree or another on the potato. So those poor farmers who I talked about in Meath, who are labourers, maybe living on the edge of these big cattle ranches, they survive on potatoes. The tenant farmers out in the west of Ireland, they survive on potatoes. They often grow crops, but those crops are being used to pay rent. Now, if you remove the potato from this, it's a terrifying vista, because everything else, it's almost like if you remove the potato, you create a hole at the base of society that everything else will fall into. Now, in 1845, we all know, maybe, or it's widely known, what triggers the Great Famine is the failure of the potato crop in 1845. In September 1845, it was actually in late August where the first signs of disease are spotted on the potato crop that year. And they're spotted at first around Dublin, and then they make their way across the rest of the country. Now, it's really quickly recognised. The British government, sorry, I should clarify for everyone, at this point, the British or Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. It has been since 1801, when Ireland was subsumed into the United Kingdom under the Act of Union. So the government of Ireland is actually the government in London. There's no independent government in Ireland. It's worth stating that, to be clear. So when the potato crop fails in 1845 in late August, or sorry, when this disease appears rather on the potato crop around Dublin in August 1845 into September, the British government very quickly, through the administration in Dublin, recognized this as a major problem. They know that there are around 3 million people that I've just talked about there who are dependent on this potato crop. And if were anything to happen to this, it would be a catastrophe. So they initially send a scientific commission. Sorry, I'm just going to open up a presentation here because I just have some slides that I just want to show. So the Prime Minister of the day is this man, Sir Robert Peel. And Robert Peel acts pretty quickly when they hear news from Ireland that this mysterious disease has appeared on the potato crop, and the disease is what we'll know as blight. They don't know what it is, but it's absolutely destroying the crop. And they're very worried about this. As I say, there's 3 million people who are dependent on this. They know that if the potato crop were to entirely fail, it would more or less collapse the entire economy in Ireland. And there have been predictions that if this were to happen, this would be the results would be dire. That said, no one had any idea it was going to happen. In any case, they take it very seriously. They send a scientific commission under a guy called Lionel Playfair to Ireland, and they investigate the scenario. And their predictions are dire. They expect the entire crop to be lost. They don't know what's happening, but this blight is spreading across the country. The British government at this point have, they're faced with a choice. They need to do something. Now, that said, while they're faced with this catastrophe where the potato crop is the food of 3 million people in Ireland and it looks like it's going to fail due to this mysterious disease, they are skilled in alleviating famines. So the British government by the 1840s have handled numerous famines, not only in Ireland, where there had been a famine there had been about 20 major crop failures in the 19th century and several in the 18th century, but they also had experience of dealing with famines in India. And certainly by the year 1800, they developed very effective methods of alleviating famine. One of those, or one of the most effective, was port closures. So what you do is you temporarily close the ports to the export of food, and then that food, by keeping that food once kept in the country, has two effects. You can feed people with it, obviously, but it also keeps this price of food down. And that's a really big thing in a famine, because what tends to happen is the price of food soars and huge numbers of people are just priced out of the market, essentially. So what you need to do is watch that. So they need to be careful. Now, that said, while doing that, while closing ports is a strategy, you have to be very careful. If you do it for too long, it can also have dire implications, because merchants, for example, would stop trading with the country if they knew the ports were closed to exports indefinitely, because that would have a huge impact on the price of food. So this is an option open to the British government in 1845. And this man, Daniel O'Connell, is the most famous Irishman of the period. He had led the successful movement for the emancipation of Catholics in the 1820s, had become a huge star politically, I suppose. This is the world of mass politics. He's undoubtedly the most well-known Irish person, possibly of the last 2 centuries. He is in his declining years by the onset of the famine, but he leads something called the Mansion House Committee. And they go up to the Phoenix Park, and they go to Orsa, or what is Orsa Nucleron today, and they meet with Baron Hewsbury, who was the Lord Lieutenant, or the Viceroy of Ireland. And they ask him to close the ports among a series of other measures. However, Hewsbury refuses this any move. He won't make, they would basically refuse to do anything. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but what underpins this decision and a huge amount of the British government strategy over the coming for 4 or 5 years, is that the economic orthodoxy has shifted, or sorry, the economic, I suppose, theories that govern society had shifted dramatically since the days when they'd closed ports. Say, for example, they'd handled the famine in Ireland in the 1780s by closing ports. But those days are past. And in the 1820s, the economic orthodoxy that underpinned the British Empire shifted towards something called laissez-faire economics. And that's liberalism. I suppose we experienced a version of it through neoliberalism. That's basically let the market function. And the market can solve all problems. I suppose we're feeling the effects of a similar ideology in terms of the housing market at the moment. But the government decided they're going to let the free market run and that this will solve the famine. And the way their logic is that if a market is allowed to properly function and the government doesn't intervene in it, what will happen is that private merchants will import large amounts of very cheap food, because obviously poor people want cheap food and starving people want cheap food. As I say, the idea behind this is that's Baron Hewsbury, the man, the Lord Lieutenant of the day. The government of Robert Peel, though, while they essentially stick to this orthodoxy, in secret, they almost admit that or recognize that this won't work, because Robert Peel's government in 1845 buys £100,000 of cheap food from the US in secret. Now, the reason they do it in secret is so that merchants won't know that they're doing it, because if merchants find out that the government is introducing or importing cheap food into the country, they won't want to sell onto a market where this cheap food is available. The government's plan is to basically drip feed this food onto the market, and that this will keep the price of food down. The first year of the famine, through everything we've discussed, doesn't turn out to be as bad as anticipated. The blight, first of all, which was this devastating the crop, only destroys about 40% of the potato crop in Ireland. It's a lot, but it leaves 60% intact. The government, or this government importation of cheap food helps. That is drip fed into markets in early 1846 in particular, and it helps keep the price of food down in general. On top of that, it's worth bearing in mind the population, the poor themselves, those who have lost potatoes, those who would want to buy potatoes on the open market, because that's a lot of people in towns would have done that. They'd have bought potatoes. What they do as the price of food, and it does increase a bit, but what they start doing is they sell everything they have. So they sell, in some cases, their clothes. If they have extra clothes, they'll sell tools. In fishing villages, they sell boats, or they'll go into pawn shops and pawn the boats and the nets, so to get money. Now, often this money is either being used to buy food or pay rent. The most desperate will go to workhouses, and these workhouses, I should say, are the only form of social services, you could say, or state social services that exist at the time. To go into a workhouse, you have to be truly destitute. They're horrific places. Families are separated. You're forced to work. But they're a measure of the absolute levels of destitution, for want of a better word. And in 1845, by the end of 1845, they're not full or anywhere near it. So while Ireland is facing a catastrophe, it doesn't seem to be that bad. And I suppose things are holding. There's a crisis, but it's not a catastrophe. So
can I just cut you off? Can you reshare your PDF there? It's not coming up correctly. Sorry about that.
You see it?
No. Yeah, if you reshare.
You see it now?
No, it's still not coming up.
Okay, it's not essential.
Okay.
In 1846, so that's the second year of the famine, this is where the situation gets really bad. It's bad for a mixture of what you could describe as poor luck and then horrific political decisions taken in London. So people are banking everything on the potato crop of 1846. The crop of 1845, as we've seen, was a partial failure with a loss of about 40% of the crop. People have taken out loans essentially by pawning really crucial equipment like fishing nets, and they're desperate basically that this crop of 1846 will be good. Unfortunately, the crop of 1846 is absolutely disastrous. The blight, this mysterious disease that still hasn't been identified, appears much earlier than it had in 1845. So it appears in the midsummer of 1846 and more or less wipes out the entire potato crop. So Ireland now is facing this huge crisis, way worse than it had been in 1845, and they're still trying to recover from that calamity of 1845. This situation is compounded by disastrous developments in London. So there's there's not a general election. There's a fall. The Conservative government of Robert Peel, who had been in power, fall from power, and they're replaced by the Liberals of Lord John Russell. Now, don't be fooled by the term Liberal. The Liberals are an absolute disaster from Ireland. They're complete ideologues in terms of the free market. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is a man called Charles Wood. Charles Wood is on the extreme right on the economic spectrum. He believes that in absolutely no government intervention of any kind in the economy or society. He's backed up in this by the man who will become the most notorious person associated with the Great Famine, which is Charles Edward Trevelyan. Trevelyan is not, as many people think, a landlord in Ireland. Trevelyan rarely came to Ireland. He was actually the head of the civil service in Britain, in the Treasury, and he had huge amounts of control over the government, intervention in the famine. So this new government takes control in the summer of 1846, just as the situation in Ireland is getting really, really desperate. Starvation sets in Ireland. Huge numbers of people now start to die in the autumn of 1846. Really major interventions are needed. People are left making a terrible choice. They can either pay their rent on the one hand or buy food on the other. Now, naturally, most people take this decision to buy food to survive, but as they don't pay their rents, these rent arrears are starting to build up, and they'll become a huge issue later on in the famine. While this is all unfolding around people, and they're facing this, that like those 3 million people that I talked about who are dependent on the potato to survive, while they're now looking at starvation in the face, you have this other dynamic that's ongoing. In 1846, those farmers that I talked about earlier bring in a huge crop that year. Now, it's not potatoes, we've seen that they're destroyed, but they bring in a big crop of things like wheat, oats, things like that. Now, they all are sold on to essentially the free market or the private market through all market towns all across the south, in particular of Ireland, from Kilkenny, say, to places like Youghal, even into Cork City. That's where the big export industry of Ireland is, or the big market towns of Ireland. But the people buying this up are international merchants, basically, who are going to ship it on to mainly Britain. Now, there's a plea at this point to stop this export of food. People can see this food being exported, and they know that two things are happening. One, that food is leaving the country and they can't eat it. But secondly, as that food is shipped out of the country, the price of everything else is going to rise, and that will happen. They again asked the government to intervene and not do this. The British government now is way more committed to this idea of laissez-faire economics, that they will not intervene in the market, and they don't stop. Not only do they not just stop the food, when people start to try and stop it through protests, they bring in the British Army to forcibly export this food. And the convoys of foods that move through the countryside the general area, I would say, between Kilkenny City and Cork City, in a kind of a triangle, down to Waterford and across, down to Cork, from Kilkenny down to Waterford and across to Cork City. Big convoys of food are moving through the countryside in late 1846, and they're being guarded by big regiments of troops to stop the poor seizing the food. And this is all in the name of the free market, essentially. Excuse me. Now, late in 1846, recognizing the scale of the problem, the British government eventually started to place orders for very cheap food in the US But this is done far too late in 1846. That food won't cross the Atlantic that year, and there's already big food shortages in Europe. So the French and Belgian government had already been into the market to buy up lots of food. So they've left it too late, bought too little, and food won't arrive. And this decision not to intervene earlier, despite the pleas to do it, despite all the evidence of what would unfold if they didn't, creates a situation where by late 1846, there is just not enough food in Ireland for the population. And this means that people are going to starve to death, and there's just no way out of it, unfortunately, at that point, in that situation essentially created by the British government. They do start to intervene in different ways. So they're adamant that this idea that the market should continue. So they set up the first, I suppose, what you could call mass intervention in the famine, and it's utterly disastrous. It's a public works scheme. It basically where people do things like build roads, harbors, things like that. And the poor are able to work on these schemes, really heavy work, and for that then they're paid a very small wage. And the idea is that if they work on these public work schemes, they can earn money to buy food, and then the market and food competes. This proves disastrous for several reasons. First of all, starving people building roads in the middle of winter is a bad idea, and they're just too weak to do it. And very quickly, people just start to actually collapse on these public works. The most famous one of them that people might be familiar with is the Healy Pass. I think that's what it's called, through the Caha Mountains in, God, I want to be careful here, is in Kerry or Cork? It's in one or the other. I live in Kilkenny, the difference isn't but the Caha Pass, sorry, it's in Cork. That road is actually a famine road. And you can imagine, if you're familiar with it, it's in the middle of the Caha Mountains. They built that in the middle of winter. And this is starving people doing this. So huge numbers of people are working on these public works, but they're just, the other problem is the food, or the amount of wages being paid is not enough to to provide food for a family in late 1846, because food had become scarce and the price of food had increased. So as you can imagine, then huge numbers of people, this is where large numbers of people are starting to starve to death. Or at this point as well, the big killer in a famine, which is not starvation, but tends to be disease, the big famine diseases take hold. There'll be typhus, typhoid, and in the later years of the famine, cholera from 1849 onwards. But the situation is dire, and you have people are facing in then into 1847. The British government are increasingly, I suppose you could say, it's a disinterest, and this is where racism comes in. Increasingly, there's a sense that the Irish, to a degree, have brought this on themselves. It's mismanagement by Irish landlords, that the idea the poor are just too lazy, maybe, to help themselves. Generally speaking, there's this feeling that Ireland has brought this on itself, and there's a providentialism, that this is the wrath of God creeping in. The British government, in about January 1847, shift strategy again. And what they decide to do is they'll drop the public works schemes. They're getting condemned in the public, in the newspapers at the time, not just because people are dying. It should be noted that the British sections of the British public, not in general, there's a lot of people in Britain who have sympathy for what's happening in Ireland, but sections of the British public are starting to complain that too much money has been spent on famine relief in Ireland. So in 1847, they established something called the Temporary Relief Act. And in the Temporary Relief Act, this is the famous soup kitchens, where the British government will open up thousands of soup kitchens across the island and provide food. It's not great food, but it is food, and it's very important. It's very, very cheap. It's the first time in the famine that the poor can really access food in large quantities if they need it. And this policy has been heavily criticised in Ireland, but it is actually an effective policy. And what's called excess mortality, people essentially dying who shouldn't be dying, falls dramatically in early 1847. but Ireland is hit by a couple of horrific circumstances in 1847. Firstly, people had expected blight. Sorry, the blight didn't come back that strong at all in 1847. However, people had been working on the public works schemes and had been so disillusioned, I suppose, after the general failure of 1846, they hadn't planted a big crop in 1847. So now they're being affected that there's just not enough food growing. However, at this point, this is where really the worst aspects of the, I suppose, the free market approach to the famine come into effect. By March, April 1847, all the food the British government had started to order in the US arrives in, and Ireland is awash with cheap food. Most of it is something that's called at the time Indian maize. It's basically milled corn on the cob. It's extremely cheap, but this is not given out for free. The British government remain wedded to this idea that people should pay something for food, and it can only be given out in absolutely extreme circumstances, which are very rare. And this reveals the true nature of a famine. A famine is very rarely, the famine in Ireland now will continue for 3-4 years, depending on where you are, 5 even in some areas. A famine is very rarely about a complete lack of food. What it's always about is how your inability to access food that is available. And that's what's going on in Ireland certainly from 1847 onwards. There is food available. The poor just cannot afford to buy it because the economy is more or less collapsed by this point. And I'll talk about that in a second. At this point, people can get food by going into workhouses. These are completely overcrowded by 1847. Sometimes in some workhouses, particularly in the West, but also in Dublin, all the big urban workhouses, the capacity is, they're at twice the capacity. Diseases run rampant through these workhouses. Where I'm talking to you now, just about 500 meters down the road, was the Kilkenny workhouse, and at the back of that workhouse, on a greenfield site, at the back of the workhouse, during the famine, they just started to bury large numbers of people, a mass grave of up to 1,000 people was dug there. And sorry, they buried 970 people in a mass grave during the famine there, and that will be common all across the country, with these huge numbers of people dying in these workhouses through disease. Now, this situation, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the famine through each year, but this situation where there is food available, but the poor are too but those who need it are too poor to buy it, continues for up into the early 1850s. And there is this food available, but the government remains adamant to try and keep a market functioning. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that the reason they're doing this is that they genuinely believe in the free market. They're not doing this to be evil. And I think that's often we moralize about history and go good and bad people. It rarely tells us or reveals the true processes at work. A lot of these people consider themselves good Christians who are doing what God would want, and that the free market will actually solve Ireland's problems, and that Ireland had had these famines on and off for decades, and that this time they would solve this issue once and for all. Now, this leads, however, to really horrific consequences. For example, the poor who can't pay rent by the summer of 1847, these huge rent arrears have built up. Landlords need to do something, and then the British government do the worst thing possible. They decide that they want rid of famine relief in Ireland, and what they're going to do is make Irish landlords and basically put the burden of funding famine relief back onto people in Ireland. So it's going to be raised essentially on a land tax. So if you have a farm, you have to pay poor rates to fund the workhouse, which will give the poor, the destitute, food. The way this is funded is that if you're a farmer, you have to pay it per acre you have. If you're a landlord, you have to pay it on all your poor tenants. This creates an incentive for landlords to start evicting tenants. And you get this horrific dynamic that landlords then start to evict tenants. In the course of the last years of the famine, you have 50,000 evictions that evict 250,000 people. Now, for some of these people, that's a death sentence. If you're made homeless while you're starving, you've very little chance of surviving. This continues. The famine ends then in various different ways in various different parts of the country. In Belfast and Dublin, it ends earliest because they've got a different type of economy where they've got different, I suppose, income. You know, there is a more diverse economy that's not as reliant on agriculture, which has totally collapsed in rural Ireland. So the famine ends in Belfast and Dublin in about 1849. There's often a myth put out there that Belfast wasn't really affected by the famine. That's not true. It was less severe than other parts of the country. But the famine starts to subside in Belfast in 1849. In parts of the West, it continues on into, it's arguably a never-ending famine for some of these people. Like the workhouses in the West are absolutely full capacity right into the 1850s and 1840s. And into the mid 1850s, rather into 1854, 1855, where there's huge numbers of people left in them. Now, by the end of the famine, the general death toll is taken to be about 1 million people dead and 1 million fled, which is a reference to the huge levels of emigration. That emigration began in earnest in 1846, in that year where people realized the situation is getting absolutely lethal. The ones who emigrate, which is quite interesting, are not the poorest of the poor. They're the people who die because the poorest of the poor can't afford to emigrate. The ones who emigrate are people who tend to have a little bit, or they have something. They could have been relatively comfortable before the famine, but 2 years of crop failures, of starvation, has taken away everything they have. And what they do is they leave at that last moment when they can, because if they wait, what a lot of people are worried is if they wait too long, they won't be able to go then. So people tend to emigrate initially to England, and then most of them head on from Liverpool to North America, initially to Canada in 1847, and then directly to New York, Boston, place like that in 1848 onwards. That's a general sketch of the famine. I'm going to talk about two things just to wrap up. The first is famine resistance. There's huge resistance to the famine when people, at times when people can, there's huge resistance to the famine when people can, in places where they can. So, for example, we talked about the export of huge amounts of food in late 1846. That crop that's exported, that when the people know if that's exported, the country is going to be plunged into a catastrophe, which it is, and hundreds of thousands of people die because that crop is exported essentially. But people are aware of that at the time, and all the southern ports, those ports, places like, as I say, from Kilkenny through Waterford, Clonmel, Carrigan-Shore, Youghal, Cork, are engulfed with huge riots, Dungarvan in particular. There's huge riots break out across all those ports in August 1846 as people are desperately trying to stop that food being exported. I also mentioned that the British Army are brought in to protect these food convoys that are being brought to the ports. That's been done because the poor are trying to attack them to get the food. Often people are raiding mills as well. So like mills where anywhere that food will be stored. Now food is often stored in mills because, for example, crops themselves aren't exported, but the flour from the crops is exported. So people try and attack the mills to get the flour. When the evictions start properly in 1847, people try to resist those. That's less effective. They tend to be sporadic. For example, one of the most famous, I suppose, acts of resistance of a form to the famine evictions is the assassination of the landlord Dennis Mahon in Roscommon. He is shot as he's trying to clear his estate. They had initially bought tickets for several hundred of his tenants to North America. However, having cut corners, large numbers of people died in transport to Canada. And then when word got back to Roscommon that this had happened, and that these people had died, this is their friends and neighbours, Mahon was also preparing to evict more people, and he was shot dead by some of his tenants at a place called the Healy Pass in Roscommon. But largely, that kind of resistance doesn't really solve the problem. The problem is an entire ideological superstructure, I suppose, of the economy, and where that is resting is in London. And in many ways, a riot in Dungarvan, shooting a landlord in Roscommon can't change the forces being unleashed on Irish society. then that brings me on to the last thing I want to talk about, which is what was this? So of late, there's been a lot of discussion that you'll find all across Facebook, numerous pages that talk about the famine as a genocide, that they'll like call people, usually tends to be very emotive language used around this. But I think what's really important is that we look at what happened in Ireland in the 1840s constitute a genocide. And so from my perspective as a historian, what you're trying to always do is understand the past. And a really important way of doing that, you have to look at what is the questions you ask. Because if you ask a question, if you ask the wrong question, you can't get an understanding of an event. And I think that's very important when we discuss the famine. For me, I don't think you can make a case that the famine was an attempted genocide. There wasn't an attempt, for example, by the British government to wipe out Irish people. That's not what was at play. Yes, was racism, which allowed them to conduct what essentially was an enormous experiment in free market economics in Ireland, but they didn't want to rid themselves of Irish people. They did want to rearrange the Irish economy, but they needed Irish people, I suppose, to use the idea of a genocide to exterminate a people. That's not the process at all. And it's also a very simplistic understanding of Irish society at the time. So, for example, a lot of times people will say that that landlords, for example, weren't Irish. A lot of landlords in Ireland during the famine were Irish. The distant ancestors may have come to Ireland or may not have been born on the island, but I think that is kind of a moot point. Some of them have been here for 300 years. Like, they didn't know where to go. They were as Irish as anybody else. And it tends to be this conflate. I think for that to fit, what it conflates is a national identity with the religion of Catholicism and then a social class of poor tenant farmers. But Irish identity is far more complex than that in the 1840s. That said, that doesn't excuse what the British government did. And I think the British government are responsible for overseeing a famine in Ireland. And in my mind, that is equally as bad. Like, they were very aware that large numbers of people were dying. They pushed ahead to essentially test out free market economics in Ireland in the 1840s, and it had disastrous consequences. I think I've talked for quite a long time, heading up on 35 minutes, and I think maybe it's better to open up to a Q&A, and if people want to ask me questions maybe about different things I've talked about there, feel free.
Brilliant. So thanks a lot, Finn. That was great. So I am happy to act as a bit of a kind of go-between for questions. So I just see one question on YouTube at the moment, but anyone else, feel free to add in your own questions. So one question is just, do you have any thoughts on Jerry Mulville's book, The Truth Behind the Irish Famine?
No.
No.
I'm sorry, I'm just not familiar with it. I'm often dubious of titles that say the truth behind. I think things like this are always debates.
Great, thanks. That's one thing that came to mind for me was similar to that. How would you have any recommended resources on reading on more in-depth history? Because it's certainly a lot more depth than I've ever heard myself.
Christine Keneally's books, I think, are a great introduction. Christine Keneally's books are a great introduction to the famine, and they're very accessible as well. Like, there's some great books, I think, that are out there that maybe some of the great histories of the famine were written by economic historians, and they can be quite dense and hard to read. But Christine Keneally's is a great mix of like social history, a bit of economic, but it's very accessible and often focuses on individual people. And she's got a couple of books. I think A Death Dealing Famine is a good introduction. She also has a book called This Great Calamity that's quite a big book, but again, it's very accessible, and that runs through, like, I don't know how old it is now, it's probably 20 years old, but I think it still kind of stands up to the test of time as a good overview of the famine. There's also great local histories, actually, if you look for them as well, that look at like how the famine would have affected local communities. There's a great one written about, like, there's some great ones written about the famine in West Cork, because I think West Cork provides a microcosm about a lot of what I've talked about there. Obviously, Skibbereen is very famous for that, but sadly, it earned that reputation. But yeah, so I think for those big overarching histories, I point people in the direction of Pristine Keneally, but also, no matter where you're from and wherever you're living in the country, there'll be a local history, because there's nowhere in Ireland not affected by it. I should also say, actually, if you like listening to podcasts, I've got a 26-part series on the famine, where I go into all the stuff I've talked about there in much greater detail.
Brilliant, thanks. So I'm just looking again at YouTube. There's another question asking what you think of a very similar policy in India from the 1870s onwards, and whether that can be seen as a genocide. You know, you were saying that in Ireland you wouldn't quite see it as a genocide, and also what you think of Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocaust.
I slightly disagree with Mike Davis. I could say Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocaust is well worth reading. I slightly disagree with some of the stuff he's written about Ireland, or he touched on Ireland and that. But like, I think it gets across a kind of a process, and I think that's a really useful way of looking at the Great Famine here. It's an extremely difficult read, I would say. Like, but I think it is one of those books that's essential reading at the same time. What happened in India in the later 19th century was done with, you might expect that maybe there had been a generation gap and a memory gap between what had happened in Ireland and what had happened in India, and to an extent that might not explain it, but that people didn't know. The worst part is they were very well aware of what had been done in Ireland in the 1870s, maybe it was in the 1880s. Charles Trevelyan, who had been so instrumental in the famine in Ireland, wrote a letter, I think it was to the Times newspaper, one of the big newspapers in England, where he advocated a repeat of the policies that they had used in Ireland in India, and was proud of the fact that he had overseen this. So I think it's worth bearing that in mind. After the famine in the 1850s, there wasn't this sense of horror or revulsion in England about what they had done. Certainly, obviously in working class communities in Britain, there would have been a very different understanding of it, where you have large numbers of Irish people living in those communities who would have had a very different experience of it. But in the corridors of power, the attitude, there's this idea that there's two people to blame for the famine. One is Irish landlords who are kind of tyrannical, disconnected from their tenants, a certain degree of which is true, but they're not really, they're kind of, as a class, they're not really dynamic enough, I think, in many ways. You could say, like, they act abominably during the famine, but they're not the cause of it as such. And then even worse still, there's the idea that it's kind of like the as I touched on earlier, kind of poor Catholics are to blame. But to an extent, what happens in India in the later 19th century really reveals how it's actually the underpinning of an economic system at play.
Thanks. So there was one last question there on YouTube asking, was the recent famine documentary on RTE a flop in your opinion? And also I'll just say, sorry, before I answer that, to anyone in Zoom, if you have a question, if you want to maybe just let me know in the chat if you have a question, and then I'll let you come in and ask your question afterwards. Thanks. Sorry, I'll leave you talk to it.
I'm actually going to have to say I didn't actually see the RTE, but I from what I heard, it was good, but I can't today. I wouldn't say myself. I actually didn't see it. So I live in a bit of a bubble away from TV at the moment. So yeah.
Great. So that's we've gotten through all the questions there, and I think we're just coming up on kind of 45 minutes on this now. So if no one has any more questions, we can leave it there. I'd like to say thanks a lot for coming and doing this talk, Finn. It was incredible, very eye-opening for me, and a great start to this series of talks. So I'll give you the floor in a second to talk about any of your own work, and just to say, if you're interested in this, feel free to follow Rebel Reads on any social media, subscribe to our YouTube. We also run a membership system, so if anyone wants to get involved or wants to support what Rebel Reads is doing, you can sign up as a member on our website. And we'll have a lot more resources to be shared online before we open our doors physically. So Finn, I'll give you the last word to finish up, and do plug yourself as much as you possibly can. Thanks a lot again for doing this talk, and thanks for coming along, everyone who watched on YouTube or joined us now.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's really great to be able to come along and talk about it. And if people are interested, as I say, you can find out more at irishhistorypodcast.ie. I also have a series on the War of Independence at the moment, and I did a series recently about Irish people who fought in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, which might interest people as well. So you can find out all that. And sure, hopefully I'll be able to come and see the shop when it's when lockdown ends. But yeah, thanks a million for inviting me.